Hi, this is Claire, and Nick and I are doing our presentation over Silence of the Lambs. First, I'm going to be talking about the actor's background, starting with Jodie Foster. When she had heard about the role of Clarice Starling, she had already won an Academy Award for her role in The Accused, so she was already a very well-known actress, and before she was cast as Clarice, Jonathan Demme, the director of the film, who you can see on the far right in the image, originally wanted Michelle Pfeiffer to play Clarice, but she had turned the role down. And it was during this time that Foster had fought hard for the role because they felt that she wasn't fit at first. But she got her role because of her determination and strength. And they felt that she did end up fitting the character of Clarice. And while it's not like directly linked to Silence of the Lambs, it's interesting, and it's worth bringing up her incident with John Hinckley, who became obsessed with Jodie Foster after watching her in the movie Taxi Driver, and he had attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan as a way to gain her attention. And like I said, it's not like directly linked to Silence of the Lambs. Both the incident with John Hinckley and the movie both deal with like obsession and psychological disturbance, so it's kind of interesting how there's like an indirect link from Foster's role in Silence of the Lambs and this real event that she had went through. And with that, Foster had immersed herself in FBI procedures and shadowed real FBI agents to train for her role in order to play Clarice authentically. And her portrayal of Clarice Starling earned her second Oscar, which you can also see in the image. Moving on to Anthony Hopkins. He was also already a very highly respected actor for his role in Elephant Man, which I believe we spoke about really briefly earlier in the class. And like many of the other actors in the film, he also studied for his role and studied various criminals and serial killers in order to prepare for Silence of the Lambs, and actually improvised many of the mannerisms that Lecter has in the film, like hissing, which was obviously kept in the film. Hopkins also won an Oscar for his role, which you can also see in the picture. And a little fun fact, he has one of the shortest screen times of a winner in this category, as he only appeared in the film either 16 or 25 minutes. Is kind of debated on which one it is, or how long he was in the film, sorry. And with this, his portrayal of Lecter has been referenced in tons of TV shows and movies, from The Office to actually Alvin and the Chipmunks, and it's still continuously referenced in pop culture today. Before Jonathan Demme was chosen to direct the film, Gene Hackman was offered to both direct and star in it as Hannibal Lecter, and he had actually already put money down to buy the rights to the film and direct it, but he obviously withdrew because he felt that it was too violent, which is when Demme was offered to direct. And he said no, and until a screenwriter had pleaded with him to read the script and reconsider, which is when he agreed to direct the film. With this, Demme used various different camera techniques, like the prolonged close-up in scenes and changing who the camera was focused on as a way to create tension. Thomas Harris, He was the author of the book that inspired the film. He was already known for his earlier novel, Red Dragon, which introduced the character of Hannibal Lecter. And in the series about Hannibal Lecter, there are 4 books: Red Dragon, Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal, and Hannibal Rising. So, historical context behind it. The first serial killer that gained mainstream attention in America was Jack the Ripper, who murdered at least 5 prostitutes in England in the late 1800s. And this is when most people became aware of the idea of serial killers. And despite this, the term serial killer wasn't really used until the 1960s and was popularized in 1983 when the FBI held a press conference about their findings of serial killers, which I will mention more later. And with that is the golden age of serial killers, which was from 1970 to 2000, which is when serial killers began to pop up everywhere, with there being 1,840 serial killers in this 30-year time span. And with that came some of the most infamous serial killers, such as Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, the Zodiac Killer, and Jeffrey Dahmer. With Jeffrey Dahmer, I just want to mention this. This is kind of a weird little fun fact about me. My mom was a parole officer in Dubuque, and one of her clients, or whatever you want to call it, her uncle was killed by Jeffrey Dahmer. So that's just a weird little connection that I have to serial killers, I guess. Kind of going off of that topic, the societal factors that cause this huge influx of serial killers was in part because of World War II and the Great Depression, and many serial killers were born and raised in the post-war years and came from broken families whose fathers suffered from PTSD and their children were then neglected, or their fathers were absent from their lives, which the highway system has actually been proven to be untrue, but it's still a very popular theory that the increasing rate of serial killers at the time was because of the growing automobile industry, which supporters of the theory claimed allowed serial killers to travel more freely and kill without anyone knowing who they were or stopping them. Despite the belief that serial killers are drifters, 74% of them actually stay in their own state. Disproves the theory that highway systems and the automobile industry had a role in the influx of serial killers at the time. Moving on from that, there was also just an overall increase in violence at the time that serial killers were most active, with there being a general rise in murder rates across America. Media. Next, I'm going to talk about the inspiration behind the character of Gum. And first, one of the main inspirations was Ed Gein, who was a serial killer from Wisconsin and gained attention in the 1950s for killing 2 women and possibly more, and also stole corpses from cemeteries to create furniture, clothing, and other trophies out of his victims' bodies, which is where the idea to have Buffalo Bill create a skin suit came from. Also kind of interesting, Ed Gein was also the inspiration behind Norman Bates, which... Next is Ted Bundy, which I'm sure everybody's heard of. He killed over 30 women across multiple states in the 1970s, and he would feign injury as a way to lure his victims to help him, which is where the inspiration of Buffalo Bill wearing a cast came from, as he is also luring his victim into get into his car and help him. Next is Gary Heidnik, which you can see in the image. He was active in the 1980s and was an inspiration for the way Gum kept his victims in a pit in his basement, as he also kidnapped and held women captive. Speak about public image. So, after President Hoover's death in 1972, the FBI's image was damaged as the public had gained access to information that was previously not made available, and this really tarnished their reputation. And as a way to rehabilitate their image, in 1983, the FBI held a press conference to speak about research they conducted about serial killers, in which they capitalized on public fears and claimed that there were dozens of serial killers active at any time that were responsible for thousands of deaths in a year, which is extremely false. It was also during this time that women were allowed to become agents. And with this, the FBI was seen as the only effective way to deal with the growing problem of serial killers, which is how they protected their funding and bettered their public image. Next is the FBI's role in Silence of the Lambs. So, obviously, it is mentioned in the movie. They do film on location in Quantico, Virginia, at the FBI training base, and with that, actors, which I had mentioned earlier, also had direct access to training with the FBI in order to make the film as accurate as possible. And with that, the FBI has always been concerned with their public image and saw Silence of the Lambs as a way to further their positive relationship with the public.
All right, let's get into some feminist and trans topics in Silence of the Lambs. One step forward for feminist ideas, and two steps back for queer and trans topics in Silence of the Lambs. All right, let's talk about Clarice Starling. She is a feminist icon. The story is really centered around her, which is great. This isn't really seen in contemporary American films. And what I mean by contemporary American films is basically any film that is really popular and captures like the cultural zeitgeist. Think Psycho or even Avatar per se. She also has no romantic attachment to any character in this film, which is really nice to see since many leading women in contemporary American films tend to have a relationship, a romantic relationship with another character, typically a man. She's also really not sexualized for the audience. She is sexualized within the film, particularly, Frederick Chilton, that's the hospital director. Their first meeting, he talks about how, beautiful she is and all that kind of stuff. Kind of creepy. Also Miggs, who was that patient next to Lecter, who threw his cum at her. Very creepy. There's also Hannibal inquiring on the relationship between Crawford and Starling, if Crawford's kind of using her for other questionable means. And then there's also Pilcher, that entomologist who directly hits on Clarice. And luckily she takes it with stride. So that was really nice to see. And then finally, James Gumb voyeuristically looking at her in one of the final scenes through the night vision goggles, nearly touching her in a couple, a couple times and stuff like that. There's a lot more to break down with James Gumb, and we'll talk about that. Also, this is very heroic femininity. This is a very typical heroic masculinity genre. FBI stories, cop shows, those kinds of things. And she kind of subverts that by being not only the leading woman in the film, but also being the only person that really solves this case. With her being front and center, she doesn't have a partner um, in the FBI or anything like that to actually help out with the case or anything like that. It's basically all her, which is really nice to see. Also, I think it's really interesting to see her as both a victim and a seeker. You know, in this case, we see both her vulnerability and her strength. She becomes threatened by Gum in the final season or in the final scene before killing him. Um, you know, that really shows her vulnerability and her fear and those kinds of things. But she also spends most of the movie searching for Catherine Martin and isn't really threatened by Gum. She's more just trying to find Catherine. And I think that shows more of her strength than really her vulnerability or her fears. And then finally, she triumphs both over Gum, but more importantly, I think at the FBI and its masculinity. Uh, there's a lot of things that happen that are, quote unquote, by the book that should go on in the FBI, and she subverts those because she goes on her own. She finds things that other men couldn't and solves a case that was seemingly impossible to actually solve at the time. Now, let's go into some of the feminist criticisms. There is a lot of people who think that this isn't as feminist of a film as many people think it is. I'll go through these and I'll tell you why they're probably wrong. So, first off, Starling made a lot of decisions based on male input. First off, Lecter guides her into finding Gum, gives her clues and stuff like that, which yeah, fair. He does do that, but at the same time, she connects the dots. She figures out all these things. She's not just a pawn being used by men to get to this final goal. She's active in the situation. So I don't know if this is a great argument for that. And then she also begins a lot of discussions with, or she begins her discussions with Lecter after Jack Crawford sends her to him, which can also be seen as that. But I think this is more of a case of, a mentor kind of teaching a student, um, or at least helping out a student to find their way. And I considered it more in that sense for this kind of film. Also, there's a lot of concern with Starling living up to her father's legacy. Her father was a cop, died in the line of duty, and some people think that she needed to meet those expectations or live up to her father's legacy. Um, Not only does she meet them, she exceeds them. But I also don't think that this is necessarily a good argument as well, because this is more of a case of, you know, a, a parent dying and trying to replicate their ideas, not necessarily a patriarchal, father-daughter relationship. Also, there is a lot of problems with, having substitute fathers and Jack Crawford and Hannibal Lecter. Crawford in this picture that we see above, Crawford's shielding Starling from the press at the end of the film, kind of as a father figure. And there's also Lecter. He provides a lot of guidance to Starling. And then also Miggs dies because of him to protect her in a way. You can see this in a couple of ways, like Jack Crawford did, where he was just doing it for his own sadistic purposes. But this one's kind of up in the air, and I'll let you decide if this is a good criticism or not. All right, now getting into the meat and potatoes. Queer horror, James Gumb. So he is initially seen as a gay character in society at the time. So at this time, trans identity was seen as a mental illness. Um, Gender dysphoria was seen as a mental illness. And this wasn't really changed until 2013. Let that sink in for a second. 2013. Okay. Following the AIDS pandemic, homosexual bigotry really skyrocketed. This was definitely in part due to the Reagan administration not really helping with the AIDS pandemic, and also a lot of the social lens on AIDS being a, gay plague. Gay people are dying from it. Well, everyone's dying from it, but this was just how society thought of it. Um, and I think most importantly for this, both of those kind of tied together, homosexuality and femininity in men were kind of synonymous. Femininity in men relating to trans women is, obviously not femininity in men, but at the time they were very synonymous. A lot of gay stereotypes are seen in these ideas. For instance, Jane Gum owns a toy poodle named Precious, very stereotypically gay. Also, nipple rings, makeup, all these kinds of things, very stereotypically gay for a man to do, which it could show you why it was initially seen as a gay character. Also, let's go into, some of the criticism from the gay community. Uh, Serial killers are made. They are made through their environment, but sexual identity is you're born with it. You can't really change that. It's a case of nature versus nurture. Your nature is your sexual identity. You can't really change that. But nurture is, you know, how you're brought up, what has happened in your past to actually cause the things that you do, like serial killing. In this case, he did have an abusive relationship at home, and he also was in the Vietnam War. And so these kinds of things could shape how James Gumb became a serial killer. Also, since sensationalizing queer people was really used to shock cis straight goers, the typical heteronormative society, they would go into this and see someone who doesn't really identify in the same way that they do, or they show off in different ways that as they do. I think this is kind of that monster idea. Normality is challenged by the monster, where James Gum is kind of a monstrous thing to cis straight society. Um, I think the most important thing here is um, Ted Levine did a couple interviews after the film was made, and who played James Gum, and he said, you don't want to beat the movie cliche over the head of the mincing homosexual. If you didn't know what mincing meant, like me, it basically means like dainty, right? So he's basically saying that, he didn't want to make his character a dainty homosexual kind of, character, but that's not what we really saw on the screen. At least that's not what I saw. It's definitely up to interpretation, but this really comes into the idea of what, Ted Levine really envisioned for himself to play as that character and what audiences really saw through that character. Okay, now let's go into the current day analysis of Jane Gum as a trans character. Um, you know, the use of metamorphosis themes, especially with the moths, really relates to trans topics of transition. It's something that you do on the outside, a social transition, that's something you do on the outside, but on the inside, you're still the same person. Same with a moth, you grow and you change, but you're still the same thing. And then also there's uh, a lot of criticism for Lecter's analysis of Gum and his hatred of identity being linked to trans topics because it it doesn't provide the full picture. One of the first things that, though it was a kind of a misdirect by Lecter, he was talking about like sex reassignment surgery and how he would have, or how Gum would have likely gone to these different places and gotten rejected. However, that's not necessarily or typically the first case for what trans people do in their transition. Usually it's either social transition or HRT to begin with before any surgery takes place. So that's another big criticism for this. Going into kind of the impact of what this film has done for the trans community. Um, the There's a GLAAD report. GLAAD stands for Gay and Lesbian Alliances Against Defamation. They had a report that found that between 2002 and 2012, trans people in media, uh, trans people played 40 or victims 40% of the time that they were in films. They played killers or villains 21% of the time. They played sex workers 20% of the time. And I think most importantly, trans slurs were used 61% of the time in their representation. If you want to put this in context, think of every single piece of media you've seen it without like trans people. How many of those media pieces have people played victims, have people, general people played killers or villains, sex workers, or had slurs used against them? Likely a lot less. So I think these percentages are pretty extreme. Um, Also with that, this along with a lot of other films of this time amplified the trans stereotype of being deceitful and disgusting. James Gumb is a very disgusting character and also very deceitful. But we also see this in a lot of other big films at the time, like Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, which really solidified the stereotype of using trans people as a joke. And then there's also other films like The Crying Game, where it kind of furthers that idea of trans people being disgusting and having to throw up for even thinking about sleeping with a trans person. Also, this is one of the first few pieces to be popular and feature a trans character. And when something is popular and it shows people in a bad light, it doesn't, everyone consumes media and is also impacted by it, so this directly affects how people think of trans people to this day. Um, this was also a catalyst for the 2000s to have a lot of really bad, trans stereotypes and jokes and hatred against trans people. There are episodes in Family Guy, How I Met Your Mother, and Law and Order SVU, very popular shows where trans people are used as jokes or killers or victims. And so this continues even to today, and as we see in current political environments. So that's pretty much all I have to say about that. Just let that sink into your mind. And thank you for watching.